Dear listener, have you ever wondered if miracles still happen in our time? Maybe you've looked around and felt that the age of wonders and signs was left in the past, reserved for ancient days. But what if I told you that miracles are still here, present and waiting, visible only to the eyes of faith? In today's story, we'll talk about an unexpected miracle, an act of divine mercy in the midst of despair, a gift that came through pain. Imagine a man wandering the barren plains of ancient Canaan, a place where hope seemed to vanish in the dry sands and scorching sun. He wasn't expecting miracles anymore. His faith had been worn down by grief and loneliness. But it was precisely in this valley of darkness that the hand of God moved in ways he never dreamed. As you listen to this story, perhaps you'll find yourself asking, could this happen to me too? Could my silent prayers, my moments of sorrow, and my long nights of struggle also be heard? I invite you to open your heart to this message, to step into the mystery and power of a miracle waiting to be revealed. Imagine a man named Lemuel, a common name in the ancient land of Canaan. Lemuel was a humble soul, known for his kindness and generosity to others, though he himself had been marked by sorrow. Years ago, he suffered a loss so profound that it left a hidden wound in his heart, a wound he rarely spoke of. One cold night, his beloved wife Rebecca fell ill suddenly and passed away before dawn, taking with her the light and warmth of his life. From that day forward, Lemuel was a shadow of the man he once had been. He continued with his daily duties, still answered the call to help his neighbors, yet the vibrant spirit that once guided him seemed to have faded. His home, once filled with joy and prayer, grew silent, haunted by the quiet sounds of his solitary prayers. And in each of those prayers, Lemuel asked God, "Why have you left me alone? Why did you take Rebecca from me?" This grief clung to him like a dark veil. Unbeknownst to him, this pain was shaping him in ways he could not yet understand. Isolation deepened his faith into a quiet resolve, and his prayers became simple whispers. To the outside world, he still seemed like a man of unshakable faith, but within himself, he felt adrift, lost in an ocean of doubt. The seasons passed and years slipped by as Lemuel grew accustomed to his sorrow. He began to think that God had forsaken him, or perhaps that his suffering was some form of punishment. Deep down, one question lingered in his soul. Could a miracle still reach someone like me? But Lemuel didn't dare to hope for an answer. He simply lived, taking one day at a time. As Lemuel carried on with his daily life, he found himself surrounded by reminders of his pain, each one chipping away at his fragile faith. He would visit the village well, where he once shared laughter with Rebecca, or walk past fields they had tended together, now barren and silent. Each place, each memory, became a source of quiet anguish, whispering doubts into his mind. Where is God now? Does he even see me? Lemuel often wondered if the God he had trusted so faithfully was truly listening. His mind was haunted by memories of the nights he had stayed up with Rebecca, praying fervently for her healing, only to be met with silence. Her death had left a void, not only in his life, but in his faith. He tried to be strong, repeating the old words of hope he once believed in, but they felt hollow now, like echoes in an empty room. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Lemuel found himself drawn to the edge of the desert. He stood on the boundary between his familiar world and the vast, unknown wilderness beyond. He looked out over the desolate landscape, feeling a kinship with it. Maybe, he thought, my soul has become like this desert, parched, lifeless, without hope of rain. As he stared into the distance, memories flooded his mind. Memories of how he and Rebecca used to believe in the power of God's promises, in his care for each of his children. They had once spoken of miracles, of the blessings they'd witnessed in others' lives, but now, standing alone, Lemuel questioned everything. "Where is my miracle?" he whispered into the vast, empty silence. "Have I been abandoned?" Days turned into weeks, and Lemuel's doubt grew heavier. His prayers became fewer, his words more uncertain. He wanted to believe, but his heart felt weighed down by unanswered questions. At times, he would sit in his small, quiet home, staring into the flickering light of a single oil lamp, wondering if God even remembered his name. But still, something kept him from completely letting go. Perhaps it was just a thin, fragile thread, a whisper from deep within his spirit that wouldn't be silenced. "Lemuel," it seemed to say, "hold on a little longer." And though he didn't understand why, he did. Perhaps out of habit, perhaps out of an old stubborn loyalty to a God he couldn't see or hear. In his moments of deepest despair, Lemuel often wandered into the hills, hoping the silence would somehow bring him peace. One night, under a sky scattered with stars, he fell to his knees and cried out with all the pain in his heart, "God, if you are real, if you are still here, show me. Do not leave me in this darkness. I cannot bear it alone." In the days that followed his desperate prayer, something unusual happened. One late afternoon, as Lemuel was returning from a journey to trade goods in a distant village, he noticed an old man seated by the side of the road. The man looked frail, his clothes worn and dusty, yet his eyes carried a brightness, an almost otherworldly calm. Lemuel felt a pull in his heart, an unexplainable urge to approach him. He couldn't say why, but there was something different about this stranger, something that felt familiar. Perhaps it was his posture or the way he seemed at ease, as if the struggles of this world were no burden to him. As Lemuel approached, the man lifted his gaze and offered a gentle smile. "Peace be with you, Lemuel," he said, as if they had known each other for years. Lemuel froze, stunned. How do you know my name?" he stammered, his heart racing. The stranger merely nodded, gesturing for Lemuel to sit beside him on the rock where he rested. As Lemuel sat, he felt an odd sensation of peace settle over him, a feeling he hadn't known in years. For a moment, it was as if the weight of his grief had lifted and his doubts had fallen silent. They sat together in silence for a time, the old man gazing out over the desert hills. Eventually, he turned to Lemuel with a soft, steady voice. "You carry a great sorrow," he said, his words both gentle and knowing. "But you must know that even in your darkest nights, you are not alone." Lemuel's eyes filled with tears. "I felt alone for so long," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I prayed, I pleaded, but God was silent. I thought perhaps he had forgotten me." The old man listened patiently, his eyes kind, full of understanding. "Sometimes," he replied, "the silence is not a sign of abandonment, but a call to draw nearer. The darkness can make us doubt, yet it is in that very darkness where faith is tested and strengthened." Lemuel's heart ached with both hope and pain. "I don't know if I have any faith left," he admitted, his words raw and honest. The old man smiled gently, placing a hand on Lemuel's shoulder. "Even a mustard seed of faith can move mountains," he said, his voice filled with warmth. "You have not lost your faith, Lemuel. It is simply hidden, like a seed waiting for the right time to grow." They spoke for hours as the sun set, casting a warm glow over the hills. The stranger shared stories of hope, stories that echoed in Lemuel's heart like long-forgotten memories. When the night finally fell, Lemuel felt a strange, renewed strength within him, a small flicker of faith, yet it was enough. Just before he rose to leave, the stranger looked deeply into Lemuel's eyes. "Remember, Lemuel, miracles are not always what we expect. Sometimes they come quietly, in forms we cannot recognize at first. But they are there, just as real as the air we breathe." Lemuel tried to thank the man, but words failed him. Instead, he placed a hand over his heart, nodding in gratitude. When he looked back to offer his final farewell, the stranger had disappeared, leaving Lemuel alone on the path with the stars glistening overhead. The encounter with the stranger lingered in Lemuel's mind in the days that followed. Every word spoken by the old man seemed etched onto his heart, as if each phrase was a piece of wisdom left specifically for him. The stranger had spoken of faith like a seed, hidden but alive, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Lemuel began to ponder this, reflecting on the idea that perhaps his faith had not vanished after all. One evening, as Lemuel sat alone by his small oil lamp, he remembered the stranger's parting words. Miracles are not always what we expect. Sometimes they come quietly, in forms we cannot recognize at first. He repeated the phrase to himself, feeling its mystery. Was it possible that God was working in his life in ways he hadn't yet seen? He thought back to the years he had spent grieving, the countless nights of prayer that had seemed to go unanswered. Could it be that even in those moments, something divine was taking place within him, too deep for him to understand at the time? He felt a strange stirring in his heart, like the faintest glimmer of light breaking through the darkness. Suddenly, memories of Rebecca filled his mind, not just the pain of losing her, but the love and joy they had shared. He remembered her laughter, her kindness, the way she always reminded him to trust in God's goodness, even when life seemed unfair. Her memory began to feel less like a wound and more like a quiet, comforting presence. In that moment, Lemuel sensed a revelation dawning within him. The stranger's message wasn't just about miracles or faith. It was about recognizing God's presence, even in the unseen, even in the silent, painful moments. His journey, his loss, his long nights of questioning, perhaps they had all been part of a path leading him to this very realization. As he sat there, an overwhelming peace began to fill him. For the first time, he could feel a gentle warmth growing in his heart, as if a seed of faith, long buried, was finally beginning to sprout. The darkness that had once seemed endless now felt like fertile ground where new hope could grow. In the weeks that followed, Lemuel began to notice a profound change within himself. His once heavy heart felt lighter, as though the sorrow he'd carried for so long had loosened its grip. Each day, he found himself reflecting on the stranger's words, letting them soak into his soul. The message that miracles are not always visible, but are still real, echoed in his heart, reshaping his understanding of faith and loss. Gradually, Lemuel realized he was beginning to see his pain through a different lens. What had once seemed like an unbearable burden, a sign that God had turned away from him, was now something he could look upon with acceptance. He began to understand that God had been with him even in his darkest hours, carrying him through every tear, every unanswered prayer, every night spent in doubt. One evening, as Lemuel sat quietly in the hills overlooking his village, he felt a deep gratitude rising within him. He looked out over the vast landscape, the fields he and Rebecca had once walked together, the sky painted with the soft colors of sunset, and he felt a closeness to God that he hadn't felt in years. The same world that had once felt cold and empty now seemed filled with divine presence, with reminders of a love that went beyond his understanding. His conversations with God resumed, but they were different now. No longer were they desperate cries for help. Instead, they became moments of quiet reflection and deep trust. Lemuel felt a peace in his spirit, a steady assurance that he was not alone, that he had never truly been abandoned. His soul, once like a parched desert, now felt like fertile ground, ready to receive the seeds of new hope. In time, Lemuel began to reach out to others who were struggling. He shared his story, not as a tale of loss, but as a testament of God's faithful presence, even in silence. He found that his own experience allowed him to connect with others who had also felt the sting of doubt and despair. His words, shaped by his journey, held a quiet authority, a humble wisdom that others could sense. Through his renewed faith, Lemuel discovered a new purpose, a desire to serve others by sharing the lessons he had learned. He understood now that his own pain had not been in vain. It had been a refining fire, drawing him closer to God, shaping him into someone who could be a source of strength for others. His life, once marked by grief, was now filled with the gentle, sustaining light of a faith restored. As time flowed on, Lemuel became a beacon of hope in his community. His days were filled with acts of kindness and service as he shared not only the story of his loss, but also the miracle of his transformation. He spoke of the deep lessons hidden within pain, how grief can lead to a deeper understanding of faith and God's unwavering love. Lemuel was no longer just a man grieving his wife. He had become a vessel of God's grace, sharing how God had turned his mourning into dancing. One particular evening, he gathered the villagers for a meeting under the stars, a place where they could share their burdens and joys alike. As they sat in a circle, Lemuel looked around at the familiar faces, some joyful, some worn by life's challenges. He felt a wave of gratitude wash over him. Here, in this space of vulnerability, was a community united in their search for meaning and connection. "Dear friends," he began, his voice steady but filled with warmth. "I stand before you not as someone who has all the answers, but as a witness to the incredible love of our God. I once thought my pain defined me, but it has instead led me to a deeper faith. I have seen miracles, not as grand displays of power, but as quiet whispers of hope in the midst of despair." He shared the story of the stranger who had appeared to him in his darkest hour. Sometimes miracles come in unexpected forms. Through the kindness of a stranger, a moment of insight, or even the support of a community. God's hand is always at work, gently guiding us toward healing. As Lemuel spoke, he encouraged each person to reflect on their own journeys. You are not alone in your struggles. God sees each tear you shed and hears every prayer. Just as I discovered that my faith was still alive, I urge you to seek your own miracles, whether in the quiet moments of prayer or in the embrace.